Friday night, August 1935. The Alhambra Bar and Theater, Harlem. Ulysses, the Bull Rollins walked through those doors with one mission: kill Bumpy Johnson. Dutch Schultz was paying dough $15 for the job. Rollins was 6'2", 240 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. He'd killed 11 men before his 25th birthday. What happened in the next 8 minutes would become the most brutal restaurant fight in Harlem history. By the time it was over, Rollins would be blind in one eye, carved up like a butcher's display, and 200 witnesses would be too terrified to breathe. Then Bumpy did something nobody expected. He sat back down, straightened his tie, and ordered spaghetti. This is the story of how a dinner date became a legend. The setup: summer 1935. Harlem was a powder keg about to explode. On one side, Dutch Schultz, the German Jewish mobster who controlled half of New York's underworld. He wanted Harlem's numbers racket, all of it. The illegal lottery was pulling in millions, and every penny was going to black hands instead of white ones. On the other side, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a 30-year-old enforcer who'd made a promise to Madame Stephanie St. Clair, Harlem's numbers queen. That promise was simple: Harlem stays black no matter what. Schultz had already sent dozens of men into Harlem. Bumpy and his crew had been picking them off one by one. It was easy. Bumpy's wife would later write, since there were few white men walking around Harlem during the day. But Schultz was getting desperate. He needed someone special, someone who could match Bumpy's violence with even greater violence. That's when he called Chicago. The Bull from Chicago. Ulysses Rollins earned his nickname, the Bull, because once he charged, you couldn't stop him. In Chicago's South Side, they whispered his name like a curse. 11 dead men couldn't argue with his reputation. Schultz offered him $5,000 up front, the $10,000 more when Bumpy was dead. Make it loud. Schultz told him, make it public. I want every numbers runner in Harlem to know what happens when they resist us. Rollins arrived in Harlem on Tuesday. By Thursday, word had spread through the streets like wildfire. Dutch Schultz's new enforcer was in town, and he was hunting the king of Harlem. But here's what Rollins didn't understand about Harlem: the streets had eyes. The shoeshin boys, the newspaper vendors, the women selling flowers on corners, they all worked for Bumpy. By Friday morning, Bumpy knew everything: where Rollins was staying, what he ate for breakfast, that he carried a .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster and a knife in his boot. Most importantly, Bumpy knew Rollins was watching him. The date: that Friday evening. Bumpy had plans that had nothing to do with Dutch Schultz or hired killers. He had a date with Helen Lawson, a senior editor at Vanity Fair magazine. Helen was everything 1935 Harlem wasn't supposed to be: white, sophisticated, educated at Vassar College. She wrote Broadway reviews and interviewed movie stars. She was also fascinated by Bumpy Johnson. They'd met 3 weeks earlier at a jazz club where she was researching an article about the Harlem Renaissance. Bumpy had been intrigued by this white woman who wasn't afraid to sit in a black club, who asked intelligent questions, who saw Harlem as more than just crime and poverty. Dinner at the Alhambra, Bumpy had suggested. Best jazz in Harlem, and the food isn't bad either. Helen had said yes. The Alhambra Bar and Theater on the 126th Street and 7th Avenue was Harlem royalty. Duke Ellington had played there. Billie Holiday had sung there. On Friday nights, the place was packed with 200 people: musicians, hustlers, intellectuals, everyone who was anyone in Harlem. Bumpy arrived at 8:00 p.m., dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a burgundy tie. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His fedora sat at a precise angle. He looked like a banker, not a killer. Helen was already at their table, wearing a blue dress and pearls. They ordered drinks. The conversation flowed effortlessly. She asked him about growing up in Charleston. He asked her about working at a magazine where she was one of only 3 women. The jazz quartet was playing something soft and low. The atmosphere was perfect. Then at 8:47 p.m. the front door opened. The hunter arrives. Ulysses Rollins walked into the Alhambra like he owned it. Bumpy saw him immediately. The way Rollins moved, shoulders back, eyes scanning the room like a predator, told Bumpy everything. This wasn't a man coming in for dinner. This was a man who'd found his target. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Rollins smiled. It wasn't friendly. It was the smile of a man who'd found what he was looking for and knew exactly what came next. Helen noticed Bumpy's posture change. The relaxed gentleman she'd been talking to disappeared. In his place was something harder, colder. "Bumpy," she asked. "Is something wrong?" "No," Bumpy said quietly, not taking his eyes off Rollins. "Everything's fine. Excuse me for just a moment." But Bumpy didn't move from his seat. He was calculating, planning, already 3 moves ahead. The approach: Rollins made his way through the tables deliberately. taking his time. He wanted everyone to see this. Schultz had paid him for a public execution, a message written in blood. When he reached Bumpy's table, he was standing. Bumpy was sitting. In Rollins' mind, the power dynamic was clear. He was wrong. "You Bumpy Johnson?" Rollins asked, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Depends who's asking." Dutch Schultz sends his regards. Says you've been a problem. Says problems need to be solved. The jazz quartet was still playing, but conversations around them were dying out. People sensed something was about to happen. "Tell Dutch," Bumpy said calmly, "that Harlem already solved its problem with him. He just doesn't know it yet." Rollins laughed. Big words for a man sitting down. That's when Bumpy noticed it. Rollins' hand was drifting toward his jacket, toward the pistol in his shoulder holster. And Bumpy made a decision. The mathematics of violence: if Rollins drew that gun, people would die. Innocent people. Helen, the jazz musicians, the waiters. Bullets don't care who they hit in a crowded room. So Bumpy moved first. It happened so fast that most people didn't see the beginning, only the end. Bumpy's hand shot out, not toward Rollins, but toward the table. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the steak knife beside his dinner plate. The knife was 6 inches long, serrated edge, sharp enough to cut through bone. Rollins saw the movement. His hand went for his gun. But Bumpy was already moving. He exploded up from his chair with a speed that didn't seem human. The chair fell backward. Helen gasped. Bumpy drove the knife forward. Cut 1 through 12. The first cut caught Rollins across the forearm as he drew his pistol. The gun clattered to the floor. The second cut opened Rollins' cheek from ear to mouth. By the third cut, Rollins realized he wasn't fighting a man. He was fighting something else, something that moved like water and struck like lightning. They crashed into a nearby table, glasses shattered. Food went flying. People screamed and scattered. But Bumpy didn't stop. Cut 4 caught Rollins across the chest, slicing through his expensive suit like paper. Cut 5 opened his shoulder. Cut 6 found his ribs. Rollins tried to fight back. He was bigger, stronger, had 20 pounds on Bumpy, but Bumpy was faster, and more importantly, he was precise. Every movement was calculated. This wasn't rage. This was mathematics. Cut 7. Cut 8. Cut 9. Rollins swung a massive fist. Bumpy slipped it like smoke, and the knife found flesh again. Cut 10 opened Rollins' neck. Not deep enough to kill, but deep enough to send blood streaming down his shirt. Cut 11 caught his wrist, severing tendons. By cut 12, Rollins was already finished. He just didn't know it yet. The audience, Helen, had pressed herself against the wall with other terrified patrons, but she couldn't look away. She watched as Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd been discussing Langston Hughes' poetry 5 minutes earlier, methodically destroyed a man twice his size. The knife was an extension of Bumpy's hand. Every movement was precise, calculated. He wasn't butchering Rollins, he was dissecting him. The jazz quartet had stopped playing. The entire restaurant had gone silent except for the sound of breaking glass, Rollins' grunts of pain, and the whisper of blade through cloth and flesh. 200 people stood frozen, watching something out of a nightmare. Cuts 13 through 24. Rollins was on his knees now, blood streaming from a dozen wounds. His expensive suit was in tatters. His face was a mask of blood and terror, but Bumpy wasn't finished. Cut 13 opened Rollins' scalp. Cut 14 found his ear, not cutting it off, just marking it. Cut 15 caught his other wrist. Rollins tried to crawl away. Bumpy followed him, the knife moving with surgical precision. Cut 16, cut 17, cut 18. Each cut was deliberate, placed exactly where Bumpy wanted it. He was sending a message not just to Rollins, but to everyone watching, everyone who would hear the story later. Cut 19 opened Rollins' back as he tried to crawl toward the door. Cut 20 caught his ankle, severing the Achilles tendon. Cut 21 found his other ankle. By cut 22, Rollins couldn't even crawl anymore. Cut 23 caught his shoulder blade. Cut 24 opened his ribs again, deeper this time. And that's when Bumpy went for the eyes. The blinding cut 25 caught Rollins above his left eye. The blade went deep. When Bumpy pulled it back, Rollins' eyeball came with it. The scream that followed would haunt Helen's nightmares for years. It wasn't human. It was the sound of an animal dying slowly. Blood poured from the ruined socket. Rollins' left eye was gone forever, the damage complete and irreversible. But Bumpy still wasn't finished. Cuts 26 through 36, the next 10 cuts were artistry. Cut 26 marked Rollins' forehead like a signature. Cut 27 opened his remaining good cheek. Cut 28 found his collarbone. Cut 29 caught his jaw. Cut 30 sliced across his throat, again not deep enough to kill, just deep enough to mark. Cut 30, 1 opened his chest. Cut 30, 2 found his stomach. Cut 33 caught his hip. Cut 34 marked his thigh. Cut 35 opened his other thigh. And cut 36, the final cut, carved a line across Rollins' forehead that would scar forever, a permanent reminder of what happened when you came for the King of Harlem. The calm Bumpy stood up. Rollins was still alive, still conscious, but broken beyond repair. He lay in a pool of his own blood, whimpering like a beaten dog. The entire restaurant was silent. Even Helen couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what she'd just witnessed. Bumpy looked down at the knife in his hand. It was covered in blood. He walked to the bar, dipped it in a glass of water, wiped it clean with a napkin. Then he did something that would become legend. He reached down and straightened his tie. The gesture was so calm, so deliberate, that it sent a chill through every person in that room. This man had just destroyed another human being, and he was adjusting his wardrobe like he'd finished a business meeting. The spaghetti Bumpy stepped over Rollins' body, not around it, over it. Like the man was a puddle in his path, he walked back to his table, where his chair still lay on its side. He picked it up, set it upright, sat down. Helen was still standing by the wall, staring at him in shock. Bumpy looked at her and smiled. The same charming smile he'd given her when she arrived. "Apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice was perfectly calm, as if nothing had happened. Then he looked around for their waiter, who was pressed against the bar, white-faced with terror. "Excuse me?" Bumpy called out. "Could we get some menace? I seem to have worked up an appetite." The waiter didn't move. Nobody moved. Bumpy picked up a menu from a nearby table. He studied it for a moment, then looked up at Helen. "You know what?" he said. "I suddenly have a taste for spaghetti and meatballs." The waiter, hands trembling, took the order. Nobody else in the restaurant moved. They just watched. The meal 8 minutes later, the spaghetti arrived. Steam rose from the pasta. The red sauce looked almost black in the dim light. Through the windows, Helen could see an ambulance pulling up outside. Medics were rushing in to collect Ulysses Rollins, who was still breathing but barely conscious. Bumpy picked up his fork. He twirled the pasta slowly, deliberately. Then he took a bite. Helen watched, unable to look away, as this man ate his dinner. Not quickly like someone trying to prove a point. Slowly, casually, like he was truly enjoying it. "It's good," Bumpy said, glancing up at her. "You should eat something." Helen looked at her own plate, which had been knocked aside during the fight. She couldn't imagine eating. Her stomach was in knots. But Bumpy ate 3 more bites, each one deliberate, each one a statement. By the time the medics had loaded Rollins onto a stretcher, Bumpy had finished half the plate. The police arrived as Bumpy was setting down his fork. By then, an ambulance had already taken Ulysses Rollins to Harlem Hospital. He would survive, but he'd never see out of his left eye again. The other 35 wounds would heal, but slowly, and they'd leave scars that would remind him every day of what happened when you came for Bumpy Johnson. The cops knew better than to arrest Bumpy Johnson. Half of them were on his payroll. The other half knew that in Harlem, Bumpy was the law. Self-defense, one officer wrote in his report. Victim drew weapon first. Multiple witnesses confirm. The message spreads by Saturday morning. The story had spread through Harlem like wildfire. Not just the violence. Everyone in Harlem had seen violence. But the way Bumpy had ended it, the spaghetti, that detail became legendary. Men told their sons. Women told their daughters. That's how Bumpy Johnson handles his business. Cool as ice, even with blood on his hands. The story reached Dutch Schultz by noon. Schultz was in his office at the Harmony Social Club in the Bronx when his lieutenant came in, white-faced. "Boss, Rollins is in the hospital. Bumpy Johnson cut him to pieces in a restaurant. Took his eye out." Schultz put down his cigar. "Is Rollins dead?" "No, but he failed." Schultz stood up and walked to the window. "You know what the problem is? We keep thinking we can intimidate these Harlem boys. We keep thinking if we send in someone bigger, meaner, stronger, they'll back down. So what do?" Schultz was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would change the course of mob history. "We'll leave Harlem alone." The aftermath, Helen asked Bumpy to take her home after the police left. She couldn't stay in that restaurant another moment. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Bumpy said as they walked out into the Harlem night. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then, "That man came to kill you." "Yes." "And you knew he was coming?" "Yes." "So the whole dinner was what, a trap?" Bumpy stopped walking. He looked at Helen with something that might have been sadness in his eyes. "I didn't set a trap. I just lived my life. But when a man comes to kill you in front of innocent people, You handle it fast and you handle it final, so everyone knows what happens next time. Helen would write about that night years later in a memoir that would never be published. She described Bumpy as the most contradictory man I ever met, a killer who quoted poetry, a gangster who tipped his hat to old women, a violent man who seemed to carry the weight of his violence like a cross. The legend, the story of the 36 cuts became legend in Harlem. Bumpy didn't just destroy Ulysses Rollins that night. He destroyed the idea that Harlem could be conquered by outside forces. Every mobster in New York heard the story, and they all understood the message: Harlem protects its own. 6 months later, Dutch Schultz would be dead. Bumpy would become the godfather of Harlem, the first black man to sit as an equal with the Italian mafia. But that summer night in 1935, with 200 witnesses watching him order spaghetti over a bleeding man, Bumpy Johnson taught the world about real power. Real power isn't just violence, it's control, it's precision. It's the ability to destroy a man and then calmly straighten your tie. Ulysses Rollins never returned to Harlem. The man who'd killed 11 people spent the rest of his life jumping at shadows, afraid that Bumpy might decide 36 cuts weren't enough. Years later, an old man who'd been there was asked what he remembered most. The spaghetti, he said. This man just took another man's eye out and he's eating pasta like it's Sunday dinner. That's when we knew. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just dangerous. He was something else, something you don't forget. Legends aren't born in big moments. They're born in details. In the way a man adjusts his tie, steps over a body, orders spaghetti. 36 cuts, one message, one legend. That's the night Harlem learned who Bumpy Johnson really was. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment: could you have ordered dinner after what Bumpy did? Next week, the time Bumpy negotiated with Lucky Luciano and changed the mafia forever. Remember, in Harlem, respect was earned. One blade, 36 cuts, and one order of spaghetti at a time.